Hi, everybody. As we getting older, the one thing I noticed is that time flies by faster and faster. Another thing I noticed, the technology improves faster and faster. Maybe the technology piece is just a function of recent explosion of LLMs, AI, and whatnot. But it's something to taking note of. And today, I want to discuss a little bit about the new technological development, data lakes. So when we think about systems, there are two things that, in my mind, there are must to have in order for the system to work well. One, there needs to be a process that the system is automating, and second, for the system to work well, it needs to have data. So the system is only as good as the data that it runs on. So that brings me to the new greatest thing, the latest thing is data lakes, which I admit that I don't know very much about, but I'm very eager to learn. So today I have Rob Stein with me, who's worked in many different finance systems. He's a distinguished finance guy, and he's implemented systems, obviously used them, and he knows a lot more about data lakes than I do. So I'm here to pick his brain today, and I'll turn over to Rob in a second here to introduce himself. But really quickly, my name is Eugene Spivakov. I've been in Treasury for more years than I care to admit. I've done pretty much everything in Treasury, but I'm more of a process guy. But of course, if you are a process guy, you do need to know what systems are out there. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. And Rob, over to you for a quick intro.
Yeah, Eugene, thanks. Great to be with you today. And thanks for that introduction. Yeah, maybe just a little bit about my background and kind of what I've done. So I've spent almost 20 years in and around finance. Started my career out kind of on the consulting side, business process improvement, that sort of thing. Worked in corporate finance groups, FP&A to a large extent. And even did a stint for a few years as a product manager, implementing ERPs and financial systems. So I was pretty excited to talk to you today about this topic. And yeah, let's kick it off.
Yeah, awesome. Well, data lakes sounds almost like a resort vacation, or maybe there should be a little bit of caution, you don't want to drown in a lake. So why don't we start off, at least for my benefit, to explain what is a data lake?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe as a bit of a preference, this topic, it seems like, is becoming more and more popular. I'm starting to hear a lot more about it recently. And hopefully we can get into that here in the talk. But maybe we can just start with, like you said, what is a data lake? Some basic definitions. Um, Basically, what a data lake is just a centralized repository where you can store all kinds of vast amounts of data, raw data. You can, store structured or semi-structured or unstructured data. And data lakes are pretty flexible in that you don't necessarily have to define the types of data or the structure of that data in advance. You can kind of just bring that in first and define what that data should look like later, which makes it particularly flexible when compared to, say, like a traditional database or even a data warehouse. But there's a lot of examples out there that I'm sure people have heard about. AWS, Azure, Google, they all seem to have their own flavor of data lakes. Some other specific vendors like Snowflake, Databricks, et cetera, they also have data lake solutions out there as well that I'm sure folks have heard about. So yeah, it's interesting, kind of how the technology is evolving, and I think the use cases are really starting to drive, I think, demand for these data lake type infrastructure.
Cool, cool. So I'm guessing as AI proliferates, so we hope that AI is going to make everything automated and our lives easier. It's going to require some kind of a source of the data to look at, and we're probably relying on AI to kind of parse through this unstructured, unformatted data in order to kind of make heads of tails of what the data is and what all of this means, and then figure out later what is going to be important within that data, what's not important. Just kind of dump it all in there, and then sort it out later. Is that kind of the gist of it?
I think so. If you think about, the typical database or even data warehouse, one of the kind of constraints, if you will, is you have to define what that data is in advance. And so, the interesting thing about the new use cases with respect to machine learning and AI is that uh, you know these systems and processes, I guess, they can operate off of this unstructured data, this very raw data, and you can train these models on that type of information. So it's actually very useful to have that raw unstructured data stored somewhere. And I think that's where the data lake, and the flexibility in that architecture really add value and really hit that use case, in a way that you can get the benefits out of a machine learning or an AI.
Oh, got it. So then the difference, you kind of mentioned like things like EDW. With EDW, basically you have to define what data you can get in there in what format or the structure, and that kind of constrains what can get in there, or maybe creates a lot of work up front to get the data in the right form in order to be able to get it into the EDW database. But with data lake, you don't need to do that work and you don't have those constraints. You just like literally lake, you just dump everything in there, right? Is that the main difference between EDW and data lake?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I think where if we're talking about kind of the differences between them, yeah, there's some architectural design differences, configuration is different. Um, but the types of data and how they store it is really, I think, where the primary difference is, at least as far as, probably you or I are concerned, right? And so it just allows you to tackle, different use cases and different challenges associated with that data. But you can store, raw unstructured data alongside or combine it with structured data, which I think gives it a bit of a benefit over, say, a typical data warehouse, which are really optimized for kind of reporting and storing clean and structured data. This gives you that flexibility to take all kinds of different formats, um, including, text, PDF, those kind of things, and not just transactional type information. So it's pretty interesting to see where the technology has gone, and how they've met some of those use cases with the data lake architecture.
Great, great. Well, I want to get into kind of like what the benefits are and get into these use cases and maybe have some examples of how this data. I mean, you mentioned PDF. I mean, that's an interesting idea, right? So EDW is going to have, like you said, transactional data, but just throwing the PDF into your database and have AI read it later to get the information that you need. I mean, that's a really cool concept. But so before we get into like how do you like what are the use cases, and I'm selfishly interested more in treasury. Before we get in there, like why now? Why is data lake concept all of a sudden becoming so popular? Because in the past, I think the concept's been around for a while. It just hasn't been on the kind of front page yet.
Yeah. No, great question. I think, the topic is certainly becoming more mainstream, and it's probably, I think, a result of, several things. But, let's elaborate on that a little bit. We've talked about, the differences in, data types and data formats and what teams are working with. But now you've kind of got this ability to start to combine these things, right? To use, I guess, treasury as the example, there, say you want to analyze, bank statements alongside, Swift messages or maybe emails or vendor files, and you want to do that kind of all in one place. A data lake offers, the ability to kind of centralize a lot of that information in those various formats. But you look at the confluence of the other technology that this is combined with. You've got very cost effective cloud storage, and compute in the cloud, that can operate at huge scale. So, I think that's another factor. And I think, the ability, another factor I think is, you can combine various systems together in such a way that you can bring in kind of your corpus of data across, say, your ERP or your treasury management system, or maybe some customer data from your CRM or other various external sources. And the great thing about that is multiple teams can now utilize the same uh, data set across multiple tools even. So I think just that flexibility and being able to meet those business use cases are a big driver. And then of course, we mentioned a couple times, but AI and machine learning models are really starting to fuel all kinds of different use cases that maybe people haven't thought of before. So the ability to, run those types of models across, large data sets and in a way that is accessible, to the end user, I think makes for a compelling case on, you know, setting up these types of systems in your enterprise.
Got it. Got it. So, kind of what it boils down to, I guess, the storage and compute power gotten cheaper and more accessible, so you can basically spread across bigger data sets now. And also with kind of rise in AI and machine learning, you don't need as structure of data, and you can kind of get more applications. I guess, I guess, put them to work across bigger data sets and get more benefit out of it.
That's right. Yeah, you're no longer relying on just production systems and using the front end that comes with, say, your ERP to do your analysis. Now you can abstract out of that and combine it with other information, maybe even external to your company or your organization, and drive all kinds of different analytics.
Do you think, like, sorry, it's kind of made a tangent question, but like within finance, we kind of think of ERP as a source of truth for a lot of things. Do you think the data lake somehow becomes a source of truth, or do you think it's just basically data that feeds into other things and other things systems figure out what's true, what's not?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, certainly, your ERPs are going to house all of your key financial data, um, and will certainly be the source of truth for some of that transactional information that is there and being recorded. But I think what this does is it gives you just another layer to get at in terms of your reporting, in terms of your analysis, where you don't have to rely on kind of pulling all this information together in Excel, perhaps, right? And trying to combine all of this manually. What this does is give you the infrastructure to do it kind of behind the scenes. Also allows you to transform the data either on the way in or after the fact. So just having the ability to do that and define these things on the fly, I think offer a lot of value, to a company that, maybe your production system just isn't capable of. Kind of the extension of it in the past has been the data warehouse, right? So you have your production systems, and then you have your data warehouse that sits in the background and does your reporting for you, but a little more rigid in terms of what you can do with the data. The data lakes built for a slightly different reason, and the ability to extract or change that information, and make it perhaps more business friendly, can offer kind of a parallel source of truth that's more easily digestible by, say, an executive that wants to look at the financials next to the operational data. So it just gives you that ability to kind of start to merge some of this information that otherwise would have been very difficult to do, with other means.
Yeah. Yeah. The one reason Excel is so popular, in my view, is because of its flexibility, but it's very limited at what it can do. It's not robust. But when you got these production systems that are very robust, they become very rigid. And it's a hassle, or it's almost impossible sometimes to reconfigure things in the ERP, for example, right? You better not, like, ERP does what it does and just let it do it. And then you dump all the data in Excel and you do manipulation in Excel. But it sounds like with data lakes, and maybe data lake is only on the source of data, maybe there needs to be some kind of AI component on top of that, or not a system component on top of that. But it might give you that flexibility that maybe was missing in those production systems before.
Yeah, I agree, and I really like your description of that. Yeah, I totally agree. Excel is fantastic, for kind of speed and the flexibility and being able to model things on the fly, but it just doesn't scale very well. You start to get into the hundreds of thousands of
Yep.
records or thousands of formulas, and it starts to really drag on your machine.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
but
it crashes, and you're like, oh crap!
then it
I
crashes,
hope
and yeah,
autosave saved it like not too far back.
that's right. Um, but they've done a lot of great work, and I think it is actually worth mentioning that because even Excel, they've done a lot of work on the kind of the Power Query side to help transform data on the way in and things like that. So they're in a way that you can see that the software providers see the value in being able to have that flexibility, but also be able to compute and analyze at scale. And that's, I think, really where the data lake, shines. It just gives you those capabilities that, maybe don't belong on the desktop, but, for an enterprise, that's, I think, something that, teams can really benefit from.
Cool, cool. Well, let's get more into specifics. Let's say I'm a treasurer at a fairly sophisticated company. So, maybe I have good ERP system, maybe I have a good TMS system. What's data lake going to do for me? Like, let's say my TMS produces dashboards and reports, and maybe even does some rudimentary forecasting, even though I have some reservations about how well a TMS can forecast, because it's maybe that's the data point, because TMS doesn't see everything that you need in order to forecast. But let's say I have the ERP, TMS, maybe some kind of CRM that I can rely on for some contract data, or maybe for some future, some kind of leading data on the future revenue growth. How's data lake going to augment things for me? How is it going to make my life easier? How's it going to make me look better?
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I think about these sort of things a lot from probably the FP&A side of the house, which is where I'm currently working. But just to maybe try to get to a couple examples on the treasury side and what some use cases might look like, and how this infrastructure can benefit a treasurer. I think there's certainly use cases with respect to um, cash flow forecasting. So maybe having that centralized view from your mature TMS, your ERP, being able to combine this information to come up with more accurate or even real-time modeling of, say your, collections and disbursements. I think there's certainly a case there that, a data lake can provide that, scale, that horsepower to do that sort of thing, even in real time. A couple other examples I was trying to think of, in preparation for the pod here is, maybe FX exposure and kind of tracking that, consolidating, your trades, your hedges, intercompany flows, that sort of thing, giving you kind of some real time, visibility into your FX. Of course, treasury wouldn't be treasury without payments and fees. So being able to analyze Swift and payment data, trying to understand where your bank fees are coming from, maybe try to reduce some of your bank fees and the errors that come with moving money around from time to time. Another one I like, this was one of my, the more interesting examples, I think, is, combining your financial and your operational data. So maybe you take your treasury and your supply chain data to do some scenario planning there, or maybe you combine it with HR to understand what, say, your payroll run might look like for making, payments for payroll in various countries or across different legal entities, and that sort of thing. So, you know, I think a lot of the, the benefits that we talked about earlier start to come into play here, which, you're combining data, you're trying to make, more accurate forecasts. And in some ways, if you can, come up with some real-time analysis or even reporting or dashboarding, I think that's really where you're going to find a lot of use cases with this type of infrastructure.
Cool. So it sounds like it's a pretty broad spectrum of benefits that you can get. Anything from analysis of transactional data to ensure there are no errors on the fees, or maybe even to understand what's driving most of the fees rather than have to kind of parse through it manually. It can be almost a dynamic indicator. It's like, hey, your fees are going up because you're doing X, Y, and Z, or you have too many transactions of this type. Have you considered maybe switching to a different type of transaction that's going to give you lower overall fee? And then all the way to forecasting, kind of this predictive component. I mean, cash flow forecasting, it's always, FP&A has cash flow forecast, Treasury has cash flow forecast. I like to think that Treasury can do a better job because Treasury starts with cash and we kind of sit a little closer to it. But it's like whatever you forecast, nothing comes out of one system. There's never, like, to get accurate cash flow forecast, you have to tap into so many different things. I mean, yes, there's the P&L. I always argue P&L actually for short, medium term is a small influence on the cash because all transactions, all activity that affects your cash in the near term has already happened, and cash is just kind of catching up to what the activity took place. So, but to do cash flow forecasting, you need to look at AR aging, you need to look at your AP data, you need to look at your intercompany funding needs, you need to look at your contracts that have already been signed but haven't billed yet. Then you got to get some predictive ability on future revenue and future contracts, right? I mean, even if you have AR aging, doesn't mean that customers pay you exactly on the due date. So, like I've done in the past, where we looked at patterns where, especially larger customers, when do they tend to pay, and then you try to predict when the actual cash comes in. But that was all basically like you have Excel and you pull in data from different sources into Excel to have your cash flow forecasting model. And, I mean, you can only do so much. You start cutting a little bit of corners, you try and make some assumptions. But what I hear from this is like, well, you don't have to necessarily make too many assumptions. You can just let it analyze the data, let it basically execute the logic that you want to execute. You don't need to pull it into Excel. It can do it in a more robust environment and incorporate all these different variables that before you just didn't have access to, or it was just way too difficult to bring it all to one place.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it just to kind of, keep going off of your point there, I do think that, a lot of times this data will ultimately end up in Excel or in some sort of dashboard of sorts. But, certainly the kind of the processing and the type of analysis that you were typically doing in Excel can now be done at a different layer of that data flow. And like we've been saying, be able to do it at scale and with a significant amount of compute resource available to you. So yeah, you may not need to cut those corners or kind of make those assumptions. You might be able to build a model in such a way that it takes in kind of the predictive elements that you would otherwise try to get to and just bake that right into your model and how you want to estimate your cash flows.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, let's assume you sold me on getting a data lake. What do I need to do to build it? I mean, how do you go about getting one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is where maybe the topic gets a little bit technical. So we'll try to keep it at a high level here. But I think in general, what we're talking about here is kind of a layering of technologies, right? So you want to think about so when trying to build a data lake or planning to build a data lake, there's several things you want to think about and consider, right? What are your source systems? What does your data look like? Because there's various technology layers that have to be put in place to make this happen. So if we're thinking about source systems and data, what we're really talking about there is kind of the ingestion of data and how you will basically pull that information into a data lake, whether it's from your ERPs, from treasury use case point of view, your banks, or maybe some other APIs. That's really getting at the ingestion, I guess, layer, if you will. Next is kind of your storage layer. So, how are you going to store it? Where are you going to store it? Are you going to transform the data, on the way in or after the fact, right? So this is what you might have heard of is, the ELT or the ETL. So extract, transform, and load, or extract, load, and then transform, right? And with the data lake, you have that, flexibility, optionality to decide when you want to do that. But storage, you want to put it in the cloud, you want to put it on premise, those sort of things. And then comes, kind of that combining the data. So what does the data model look like, right? Much like a database or a data warehouse, there's hopefully a plan on what you want to get out of that system, which would lend itself to kind of your architectural design. But with the data lakes, you don't necessarily have to define all that up front either. So, that's another consideration, is how you want to process and, transform that information. And then I think, going beyond that is just defining your use cases. What do you hope to get out of this that you're not currently getting out of your existing systems and process? And what do you want it to look like? Do you want to have visualization? Do you want to have dashboards? Do you just want the raw data available to query in something that's maybe using a SQL script? Or do you want to pull it into Excel, Tableau, Power BI, that sort of thing? I'd say that's probably the kind of the main considerations. There's other stuff too, like, governance and, integrations with machine learning and AI, of course. But I'd say that, kind of the stuff I mentioned is probably the minimum items you want to go after and consider when planning and building out your data lake solution.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of decisions need to be made. So it sounds like, to recap, you need to figure out how you're going to get the data into the data lake. So it needs to be an ingestion mechanism. You need to figure out how you're going to store the data that you're going to get there. You need to figure out what are you going to, as far as transforming the data, do you do it up front or do it after the fact? But more importantly, you need to identify kind of what are you hoping to get out of it. And at some point, you need to, make a decision. Okay, what are we doing this for? Like, what problem are we solving here? And I guess I'm curious on this latter point, right? Do companies kind of get started with one vision, and then as they build it out, they kind of either they pivot, like, oh, we didn't think we can do X, but now we can, so let's do this new thing, or kind of as they do one thing, they say, okay, well, let's do the next and the next and the next. Like, how does it evolve? I don't know if you've seen any examples out there.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen in the past is, I guess with respect to this topic, that, it's very difficult to try to define everything up front. I mean, I'll say that. Obviously, the more you can try to decide on up front, the easier the implementation would be. But this technology is not limiting in the sense that you have to take kind of that waterfall approach. If you're talking about kind of implementation methodologies, which is, I guess, kind of the analogy here, you could probably take more of the iterative approach when it comes to this sort of thing. Because, when you're dealing with multiple systems and, all kinds of various, forms of data and information, and it's actually quite challenging to figure out where all of it is being used today, let alone where you want to take it in the future. So I've seen companies have success with kind of this iterative approach, where you define a couple core use cases. Maybe you pilot them first, see what works, what doesn't work. you figure out what some of your kind of metadata or master data needs to be, which is, hey, we're going to align on some current, or we're going to align on some, kind of common, you know, data sets or data fields that we're all going to use. So maybe, like, for example, your fiscal periods are all going to be defined the same, right? Or your legal entities are all going to have the same name. And just making sure that, you have some of these, fields defined up front, I think can go a long way. But it's not necessary. You can transform that data as you go. You can transform it in real time. So in other words, you can have separate master data, if you will, that that can translate back and forth between different reports or use cases. But a cleaner implementation, and one that I think makes it easier for people to build on, that having that strong foundation. The more you can define up front, the better, and easier to work with over the long run, I think, too. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah.
that's probably.
Well, I mean, my takeaway is that nobody knows up front exactly what they want to get out of it. There's some idea, and you start with a few things, and then kind of see how it evolves. I mean, to me, it makes sense, especially with new and very broad technology. You want to kind of start with something and then kind of build on top of that. That makes sense. I mean, it's a little bit daunting to kind of embark on this, journey when you have so many things where you got to build the actual infrastructure, but you also kind of have to define so many things. If you don't have to define as many of these things up front, it's easier to actually get the ball rolling and get started. And then you can.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's why I think the kind of the pilot approach is certainly an option for for companies and teams to embrace, because it allows you to kind of get some of that basic infrastructure built for maybe a small set of use cases, and then you can adapt from there. In other words, you don't go too far to the point where you can't turn around or pivot in a different direction. And so starting off small, I think helps. But maybe just to linger on that point, this can be quite daunting because you're effectively building out some back-end infrastructure, right? And that's generally, I would say, not a core competency of a finance professional or even a treasury professional, to be more specific here. So yeah, it can be quite daunting. And certainly having maybe a vision or a strategy from the business side, from the treasury side, on what you want to get out of it will go a long way when you start partnering with your IT teams, and even perhaps maybe you have some transformation teams on staff that can help bring this thing to life. But just having that information kind of thought through up front will go a long way in helping to bring a solution online.
Cool. A very quick question here. For Treasury, does Treasury have its own data lake, or is this part of kind of the bigger, finance or bigger, broader company lake?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it depends, really. Just, I guess, speaking just from the technology or the solution point of view, a treasury team does not necessarily need its own data lake, meaning, these systems can work just fine housing treasury data as well as, say, FP&A data, and, maybe some, accounting, AP, AR type information that you want to have in there, and maybe, your vendor and customer information, everything in, one spot. And there's benefits to that, right? Because these things can scale across an entire enterprise. But things are changing, and I've seen and heard of treasury groups kind of taking the lead on that effort and building their own data lakes. Whether or not those extend across the enterprise, I think is a matter for those teams. But I would say those that are perhaps a little more sophisticated or forward looking in their operations, have kind of plowed ahead with, building out their own infrastructure and setting that up. I think the counterpoint on why you would want your own data lake as a treasury organization is there might be some reasons or risks associated with the data that just need their own space, if you will. Maybe there's some sensitive information around, say cash or your counterparties or, bank account information that, you really don't want to have available. I think that's probably a valid concern, but something that can be solved, in a data lake. So I say it kind of depends. You don't necessarily need your own data lake, but there's probably some other reasons. Maybe you have some kind of custom schema or design that you want to work with that just won't work with other areas of the business, perhaps. Or there's some perhaps vendor specific integrations with, say, like Kariba or was it FXall is a treasury system that, maybe you need to have kind of this separate instance of a data lake to make that happen. But I don't know that that's actually necessary. So I just think it depends.
Cool. Well, let's say if you're a business leader of a company, maybe you're CFO, CEO, another business leader, at what point should you seriously start considering data lakes? I mean, if it's a small startup, obviously probably doesn't make sense. I'm guessing if you have 100 billion in revenue, it probably definitely makes sense, and I'm sure they already have sophisticated tools and sophisticated systems, and their IT teams that are huge. They're looking into this. But where is this threshold that you think businesses should start really paying attention to this?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules here either. I think to your point, I think, the smaller teams, there's probably not as much value add to them, just in the sense that they're probably trying to operate very quickly and very flexibly at a small company. And it could be the case that a lot of their tools and processes, even data for that matter, is just not really that mature. But having said that, I think there is benefits to establishing, a data lake, even in smaller organizations, because it can bring a lot of information together in one place. If an organization, for example, doesn't have, say, like a treasury management system, this might actually add quite a bit of value in bringing a lot of the information together such that the teams can operate a little bit more effectively. So, I don't know if it's size of company or size of teams that would kind of be the leading indicator there for, when it actually makes sense. But I think that the complexity of the data and the number of systems is probably the stronger indicator of when it starts to make more sense to implement a data lake. And what I mean by that is, just the complexity of the data, the number of source systems you have, how many daily transactions you might be operating with or analyzing, really might cause a team to look into a data lake sooner than later. So I've heard of companies that have, multiple ERP instances, hundreds of subsidiary companies, very unique business challenges. They would probably benefit from just the data centralization characteristics of a data lake more than anything. And the great thing about, this type of infrastructure is that it scales, to the largest of enterprises. So if you can kind of get some of those good behaviors around process and data kind of instituted, and you could do it with a data lake, earlier the better is probably a good way to think about it. But, the teams need to, think about what their needs are, not only now but in the long term. Um, and that all comes back to maturing and developing your org, and um, how many resources you have available to you as well, right? Because you're going to need some support, uh, at least a little bit from your IT
Yeah, well,
partners.
I don't think I can do it myself, so it's definitely good to have a lot of support on it. Yeah, cool. We talked a lot about the benefits of a data lake. What about the risks? Anything to watch out for?
Yeah, I think risks can come in a number of different forms, and the risks aren't going to be any different than any other system that you're using with financial data. Poor data quality issues. It's still to a large extent kind of garbage in, garbage out. So you really want to understand and make sure that you have good data quality as much as possible, or you want to try to clean up your data in the process of implementing something like this. And you can do that with kind of transforming your data on the way into a data lake. There could be other risks around integration. So it's not that every single system is designed with a connector or has a way to kind of ingress or egress data from a data lake. So you might have implementation issues around integrating with source systems or downstream systems. There's probably also some compliance risk too, if kind of the information is not secured in transit and at rest. And you could have other kind of more operational risks around like who actually owns the data once it ends up in the data lake. So maybe that goes back to your earlier question around, does treasury need its own data lake? So you might have some risks around ownership of the data. There's also risk with the vendors, right? So this is all I would say new within the last 10 years or so. I'm sure somebody on the internet will probably correct that, but it's still fairly new, I would say, for finance and treasury. And so adopting a specific vendor could be a risk if it's maybe a vendor that isn't proven in the space, or maybe there's some format changes or technological changes that could be a risk. So it's kind of like other implementations where you kind of have kind of that general set of risk that you should be thinking about and consider.
Cool. Yeah, you mentioned some of the vendors that are going to be doing things for you. What tools vendors do you need to implement data lake? And you mentioned some of them before, and my one concern I have, it's a pretty daunting tech stack that you need to just even run a data lake. Is that the case, or how difficult is it?
Yeah, no, great question. Like if we're thinking about kind of these cloud native type systems and platforms, that's certainly a viable solution for any organization. The good thing about those is that they tend to kind of cluster a lot of the tech stack in such a way that there's this interoperability between the different layers that we were describing earlier. Maybe the larger enterprises perhaps want to do some of that outside of a cloud environment, or maybe they have different use cases or different tools that they want to use. But certainly there's the kind of the storage and compute that we discussed. But there's also how you want to do your analysis and what type of reporting do you want to do, or is there some type of automation that you want to incorporate into this? Is there connectors for other various applications that you want to use, like Excel, or workflow integrations? But yeah,
Cool.
that's probably what I would say there.
Cool. Well, I want to wrap this up with the one last question. If you embark on this mission and you implement data lake, how do you measure success? And metrics, specific milestones, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, very important, right? So you want to get some sort of ROI for doing all of this work and setting up a infrastructure. Um, but it's like I guess the way I'm thinking about it is probably along the lines of what is it doing for your operation, right? Is it enabling you to be more accurate in your forecasting? Is it helping the teams manage the operation more effectively and efficiently? And so some of the areas that um, I think come to mind here is just time saved, right? Is the team able to take some of the manual processes that they were otherwise doing and automate them, or make the recurring stuff something that can be done, in the data lake itself, and just report out, so we can spend more time, perhaps analyzing the data rather than crunching the numbers, running the business rather than tripping over our Excel modeling and our Excel templates, right? Um, it could also give you, cost savings. So, if I'm thinking about treasury, uh, kind of from the outsider's perspective, bank fees or FX, right? So maybe you have the ability to, kind of cluster some of your transactions or some of your money movements and things like that that could generate some savings for you, give you some negotiating power with your banks on negotiating fees. It might help you with your FX hedging, being a little more precise on that hedging, saving some money there. Can help with things like audit, right? Your compliance efforts, streamlining some of that, having those reports built in such a way that you can show the lineage of that data
Yeah, I
from
guess you
source
can just fish
system.
things out of data lake very quickly, the information that you need for the auditors to support whatever
That's right.
they're auditing. Yeah, that's a good, very
That's
good
right.
point. Yeah. Yeah.
And then yeah, but just sorry, just one last point, and I think too, these are new technologies, and so they might even offer the ability to kind of retire some of your old systems that maybe aren't as useful anymore, or that are very expensive or proprietary. And so I think there's a number of benefits and ways I think you could measure ROI on implementation like
Yeah.
that.
No, it makes sense. So there could be some direct savings either
Hmm.
from reducing fees or maybe retiring some systems that you don't need anymore. There are definitely some forecast accuracy improvements that you can probably measure compared to your previous, whether it's cash flow forecasting or FX exposure forecasting. So either you get to reduce risk more, I guess, precisely deeper to the greater hedge to the greater extent, or if your cash flow forecast is more accurate, it has tons of benefits, including being able to allocate cash where you can actually earn interest rather than having to keep an extra liquidity cushion, things like that. And then obviously freeing up some man hours and automating things. I like your audit example because
Hmm.
if you've been in finance inside a corporation, you've dealt with auditors, and auditors rightfully so ask a lot of questions and require documentation support. And a lot of times you're spending so much time pulling up that support. Normally, you kind of anticipate and you save it in certain folders, but sometimes you don't have it available, and you have to look through emails or request it from somebody else. So if it's in a data lake, you just fish it out very quickly, and you're done. So yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this overview. I think this is super helpful, super insightful. Definitely, my understanding of data lakes is greatly improved now as a result of this conversation. There's obviously other things you mentioned to me before, I think lake houses, but we'll save it for the next conversation because
There
I'm
you go.
sure that this subject, there's a lot more topics to be discussed, and we can probably go much deeper. But I think this is a great overview for the first time.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And yeah, hopefully we've made it accessible at least to a broader audience. But yeah, it's a very fascinating topic, and hopefully we give the listener here some food for thought.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks again, Rob. Really appreciate your time and appreciate your insights and the knowledge on this. very exciting and very kind of a technical subject matter.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Eugene.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.